Yeah, falling off the stool is probably not. That's my job.
No, I'm not. Being very kind.
I think this should work. Yes, this one. So if anyone is in the lobby and would like to take a seat, that would be excellent. So I'd like to welcome everyone to the Atlanta Contemporary Arts Center. I know, and my colleagues who work here know, that we're not surprised when we have amazing turnouts on Saturday at 11 o'clock. I know visiting guests are often stunned that there's a hunger for art chat this early in the weekend. So while I understand that this is something that is really great and we appreciate you coming, I never want to forget to thank you for doing that. And so for people who visited other talks and lectures that we've done, you know that whenever possible, we try to have participating artists who are exhibiting their work here make some time to share their thoughts about what they do with you. I'm often the spokesperson for the exhibitions when artists are not here. And I will tell you that me talking about their work is extremely different than them talking about their work. And if you had the choice, I'd go them. So I just wanted, with that in mind, welcome Dana Schutz and Stephen Schofield. Dana obviously is having a small survey of her drawings and prints, pretty much from 2004 or so up till 2 weeks ago in terms of very, very recent work. And Stephen Schofield is participating in the Embodying exhibition, which is a show that I think tries to deal with masculinity from a few different points of view, but includes 3 of the recipients of Artadia Awards from San Francisco, as well as Joe Beal from Los Angeles and Stephen from Montreal. So I would just say this is a very casual conversation. I'm going to ask them some questions, and at some point you'll have an opportunity to ask them some questions, and that's the way we do it. So you're probably sitting on some questionnaires that I don't think you can fill out that way, but at the end of the talk, please give us some feedback as to whether you liked what you saw today, and it helps us with various grants and just gives us a sense of what you think we're doing. So without further ado, I guess I would just start with Dana in this case. I think most people are familiar with Dana's work in this crowd and in the art world through her paintings. I think it's fair to say that that's the work that's most well known. The work that we are showing, and I was very excited to develop with Dana over the last 2 years really of discussion, was to try to show the ways in which drawing factors into her practice and printmaking as well. So I think I would just ask you, if you would, to talk a little bit about the role of drawing in what you do, how you do it, when you do it, what it means, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, drawing, it's actually really hard for me to talk about because it's something that I never think of as a very framed practice, or I never think, oh, now I'm drawing. It's usually when you're in the studio, and a lot of times I would make thumbnail sketches, or really rough drawings, and I never really thought of as finished drawings. But there are periods of time where I'll actually and it's usually I'll kind of stop painting or start, the drawings will kind of take over. I'll start doing them more than the paintings. And usually that's like when I'm in between and I don't know what to do painting. And I find it really helpful. And like the self-eater drawings, they kind of started before I was making the paintings of people who could eat themselves. And it was something that I actually didn't know if I wanted to make my work. And they were kind of doodles, almost like the type of things you would do on the phone. And yes. And
deal with that.
Yeah. But I became more interested in them than what I was actually painting. And it was really a question of like, oh, could this be my work? Like, could I make paintings of these? And But recently I've been drawing a lot more, and maybe because it's in one of those periods of time again where I'm trying to figure out things in the studio, and I feel like that that's what I really want to be doing now, is drawing.
One of the things that I think was being, I mean, I know I wrote about it in the small brochure that we made, and we was talking about it last night as people were looking at the works. And I just have to say, I mean, I don't remember exactly when you and I met, when you were at Columbia, but one of the things that was really interesting for me as a curator, talking with Dana very early on, was the role of predecessors, artists who've gone before. It really impressed me, and I know I've told you this, that when I asked you about artists who you were looking at or artists who you were thinking about, you said at that time, mid-period Matisse, because you were interested in like how to paint shadow, shade, figures in shade, which I thought was interesting. We talked about Alice Neal. And the thing that impressed me was you mentioned absolutely no contemporary, like no John Curran, no Lisa Yuskevich, no...
Oh, but I could talk about that.
I'm sure you could, but so I was interested in that idea, and so I think people last night were talking about, you know, late Picasso, and you know I mentioned Beckman. I think there's a tremendous subtlety and a connection to early Hockney. I mean, and Peter Saul. We talked about a lot of people. Maybe you just talk a little bit about how art history influences some of these things.
Yeah. Well, when I first started thinking about contemporary painting, like in the 90s, when I first started painting and thinking of myself as an artist, there was a kind of feeling where you could combine a lot of historical styles together in a painting. And then it started to feel like this problem, like it felt really restraining, like that you had to be really hyper-conscious of every reference that you were using in the way that you know, like you would have an abstract expressionist thunderstorm or something, and I felt like that felt maybe in some way it seemed kind of permissive, like that you could do anything in a painting and combine a lot of things together. But then I also felt like it felt like a straitjacket, like that there had to be this sort of space in between where a kind of more intimate relationship to mark making, and so I think that the way that I look at paintings, and probably the way a lot of people do, is actually much more personal, like much more intimate. Like you'll like notice one part of a painting, and then that sparks the idea for an image. And I feel like references I like, but I feel like they have to be more fluid, or they can't get sort of stuck in a piece.
I wanted to ask, this may be an interesting segue to Stephen, whose work is represented here by sculpture and is primarily known as a sculptor. But if you look at the pieces that are here, the debutante figures, the relationship of how those sculptures are built is very much drawn. And I thought it may be part of a handoff to you would be to talk about those sculptures in relationship to drawing, maybe talk about the text that is connected to them a little bit, and go down that road for a minute.
Sure, I can do that. Well, a debutante, maybe it just speed things up, is a short tale that Pliny the Elder told to explain the origins of drawing. They wanted to figure out how drawing was first conceived by humanity. And so the story it's actually a really short story. It's only 2 paragraphs in Natural History by Pliny the Elder, which is incidentally a wonderful book to read. It's full of all sorts of very odd stories about the origin of drawing, the origin of painting. But in this story, debutante, she knows that her lover has to go off to war, so she takes him to a cave. They make love. He falls asleep, which I always think is such a touching moment. He falls asleep. And she picks up a candle to look at his face, to memorize his face, and realizes that his profile is projected on the back wall of the cave. So decides to pick up a piece of charcoal and traces his profile. So for the Greeks, they thought this was an interesting idea, that drawing was a trace of reality. It was actually a piece of reality that was transferred into art. The story sort of speeds up and doesn't. We know that he leaves. Implicitly, he doesn't come back. You know, life is fugitive, and art is eternal. The drawing stays there, and later Diputata's father, who was a potter, takes some clay and fills in the profile of the face and produces the first sculpture. So the origin of drawing leads to the origin of sculpture, which incidentally is kind of interesting because here in North America we always, in most schools anyhow, I know a number of you are here from a school, generally it's painting and drawing department together. In Greek thinking, painting had nothing to do with drawing and sculpture. Drawing and sculpture were two kinds of art, and painting was on another level. It's the difference between the mnemonic and the mimetic, but you don't need to worry about that. But anyhow, I liked the story, and I wanted to do these pieces partly about someone being there, not being there. My partner lives in Toronto. I live in Montreal. They're not that far apart, but they're far enough apart that a good part of my life is spent thinking about who's not around. And so what I did was I decided to trace the pattern. I had a sense of what the pattern was going to look like first, and to a certain extent the pattern started in my mind first as something I traced the pattern with water-based pastel on Michelle's body, and then took Chinese silk paper and pressed it on so that I could get an imprint of sort of each section of his body, the divisions on the pieces that you see here. Then traced those back onto pattern paper and adjusted them with, you've probably seen those beautiful curves that they use in cloth tailoring. So you can work out what the right curves are, how you can get two pieces to join so that they swell out nicely. It also helps you figure out whether you cut cloth on the selvage, whether you cut it on the bias. I mean, there's just all sorts of kind of technical ways to make something swell out, which is what I wanted. I wanted the sculptures to have a sense of breadth. So, yeah, they were about drawings. They started with drawings. What I usually show as drawings, mind you, is fairly different. I do have a drawing practice. It's very seldom attached to, this is an exception where it's in preparation for the sculptures. Most of my drawings are parallel to the sculptures. In other words, I generally make in drawings what you can't make in sculpture. Like in sculpture, you know, ultimately it has to stand up. There's always this problem of gravity. You know, how do you make the whole thing? You know, you're generally in sculpture, you're so grateful if the thing stays together that it's this constant problem. How do you construct something? But in drawing, often it depends also when you're drawing. I often draw at night. I don't know about you, but usually I'm too tired to actually think to make sculpture. There's too much preparation, but a drawing I'll do it at night in my studio, often with one lamp on. And it's that sort of concentration. It's where I do all the things I can't do in sculpture. So I kind of think of them more as complementary. I mean, there's tons of things you can do in sculpture you can't do in drawing too, but usually what I do as drawing is not preparation, it's more parallel.
Do you want to just for a minute explain how those sculptures come to be what they are? I mean, I think people just looking at them probably don't know the sense of how they are finally produced.
Okay.
Just to get that out of the way
Right.
on some level or another.
Okay, well, I'll just tell you really quickly. These two pieces in particular are made from, for the most part, from cloth that I recuperated actually, back to my partner, Michelle Dagneau. His mom died 3 years ago, and she'd saved lots and lots of clothing from her kids, 7 kids, 5 brothers, they all got the same jackets, different sizes of course, but the same jacket, same pants, and so there was just tons and tons of carefully ironed, fixed cloth that was in the basement. So I took a good part of it and cut these pieces out of it. There's also 2 of Michelle's brothers are hockey players. One is, if you know hockey, J.J. Dagneau, who won the Player of the Year award when the last time the Montreal Canadiens won the Stanley Cup. So I got a lot of uniforms and cut them up. So there's 2 versions of sports pieces, but so they were also kind of portraits of not just of Michelle, but that family. And I used those fabrics. Now I'm using Bach clothing, and the tuxedo white cloth is actually new. That's not old cloth. But anyhow, it's cut up, sewn together, soaked in sugar water, and then the pieces, it's mainly just the shell that's the piece. There are some little bridges that pull it in, sort of nips and tucks, so there's so your forehead comes in, or there's that fold at the shoulder. But other than that, what you see is it's just soaked. Used the leaf blower to blow it up, and that dries them out, so the water evaporates and the sugar forms crystals on the interstices of the fibers and gives it lots of rigidity, so it's kind of like a...
So what seems stuffed is in a sense inflated.
And it's empty.
And empty, right. In the era of not only multidisciplinary artists, but artists who have what's often referred to as a post-studio practice, the 2 of you are decidedly studio artists. I mean, in the sense you work in a traditional place with materials. Could you talk a little bit about the nature of the studio? Dana, I know you work in a studio in a building with other people, so there are a lot of sort of tangential people and making and conversations going on. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about the nature of either the solitariness of making in the studio and what the kind of things come into play there.
I work in a studio with, there's a lot of friends who are also in the studio building, and I find that that's really great because you don't have to really leave to socialize. We can have lunch together, but everyone respects each other's space, and everyone has their own studio. But usually I tend to work at night, and I like that time because people don't call, and you don't really know what time it is. And I used to have windows in my studio, and I blocked them up because the sun was really intense, and it would bounce off the paintings. I actually have a lot of artificial light. It's all artificial light, and I spend a lot of time preparing when I'm making paintings, like where I'll mix paint sometimes for hours or a day, just mixing colors, and I do that so I don't have to stop while I'm painting. And of course I'll adjust them and change them as I'm going along. But and usually in the morning when I get there, I write or doodle, or I don't know if doodle's quite the right word. but yeah, I'll write down ideas, or just almost like brainstorming, like kind of really unconscious kind of writing or listing things.
One of the I actually was going to ask you about language just for a second, because one of the things that became very well known was your relationship to language or ideas that generate paintings. And so I think one of the first, Frank from Observation was a show, one of your first shows, which really was an idea about a narrative that then generated a whole suite of paintings. And we have drawings in the current show, Smoking, Crying, Swimming, which are, in a sense, verb lists that generate imagery. So maybe it would be interesting just to talk about what that writing does, or how language generates image for you.
Well, I don't paint from photographs, and it's not that I have anything against photographs, it's just I think they're great as they are, and I don't know what I would do with them. But I'm very interested in imagery, and I think imagery is like this, the image is this thing that can sort of hover. It's not a depiction or a picture, but it's this way that elements can configure, and they're kind of always in flux. I feel like the image is kind of located in your mind, and I would come up with a situation that was sort of a simple fictive situation that was often a physical situation. And usually it involved a kind of problem, like if you were the last person on Earth and there was only one other subject, like, and you happen to be a painter, like how would this subject appear? And then who would be there to tell you that it's not exactly how it appears? You know, and then what would you, if you were to make other people in that situation, how would you do it if it wasn't the obvious, you know? So you could like build other people out of that subject, and so I really kind of liked a fictive situation. And recently, I've been looking at language, or these kinds of verbs that could work together, and it was more about the space in between the words. Like there's a drawing in the show here, which is like swimming, smoking, crying, and I kind of like those verbs together because they're impossible to do together. And then there's this question of like, well, how would you depict it? If something's kind of impossible, like how do you begin to depict? And I used to be on the swim team when I was in high school. I was terrible at it. And I just remember that feeling of, you know, when you're swimming and your head is underwater and there's like a real interior space and you're in your own lane, and I would scream like Nirvana lyrics because I was in high school, you know. And I thought, you know, it really felt like your own headspace. Like even the sound of it really feels like your own headspace. But then I found out that like sound travels much more underwater. Which would explain why I didn't have very many friends. But in terms of like figuring out how to make that image, I was like, well, how would this be? You know, like the head would sort of feel like this big island, and or like the underside would be almost like the underside of a boat, and you know, smoking has a lot of sort of signifies that something's wrong, but you know, when you're upset, you can have a cigarette, but it's also kind of nonverbal. It's sort of like you know, your own interior situation. Maybe, but so I kind of, it really felt like this situation that could be much more about breath or private space. And Stuart was talking about the eye, that it sort of felt like a shark, and that also I felt like that's a kind of signal distress, but I don't know, but it kind of comes along as I'm like making the painting, like certain things will configure and they'll either be accepted or rejected, or you know.
Stephen, you want to pick up the thread from the nature of the studio and the question of, you know, I mean, I having known your work for a long time, there's always a series of material tests and research in terms of what materials do. But if you would just talk a little bit about the nature of what goes on in the studio, solitariness. I know you've worked with assistants more of late. Maybe just a little bit of that nature of what the studio is for you.
Sure. Well, actually, I think that for me, there's kind of a continuum between the kitchen and the bathroom and the bedroom and the studio. I kind of like the sort of alchemy that there is in domestic spaces. There's a kind of transcendental moment the first time you've ever made a mayonnaise sauce. You know, you've got an egg yolk and you've added a bit of salt and pepper and lemon juice, and then you start adding oil and it binds, and there's just this amazing thing where the egg yolk keeps binding. You know, if you really want to be daring, you make a hollandaise sauce and then try and heat it up so that it doesn't turn into scrambled eggs. But a lot of, I mean, that's sort of a kitchen image that appeals to me, but I'm just amazed that the kinds of things there are in our homes, those very daily moments. Toothpaste can be really a remarkable thing for me. It's maybe a bit different. You were saying about things that don't exist or couldn't exist or are impossible. You were talking about that. I guess maybe my thinking is a bit simpler. I'm just taken with things that really do exist but are looked at a very close level. And those are the things that often turn into pieces for me. So that kind of alchemy in the kitchen or in the bathroom or in the bedroom, because I also like the kind of a certain kind of sexiness in working with materials. It's so easy to pick up anything, whether it's I mean, for years when I was quite young, I was teaching ceramics to kids, like teenagers, and there was guaranteed that the first time you gave people clay, half the group would make an ashtray container, and the other half would make a penis. So it was sort of like there was something in there that I thought was inherent to the materials, and it doesn't really matter. You could also do the same. I never taught sewing, but I'm sure that in fact, just people sort of, if they sort of forget what they're doing, there's this sort of flush of recognition that there's kind of bodily quality to materials, and so a lot of what my studio practice comes from those other rooms of the house.
You want to talk a little bit? I think in the case of your exhibition, history has been pretty solid in New York and other parts of the United States, but obviously this being the first time the work is being shown here in the South, people may not be familiar with the range of things that you've done. You want to put these sculptures in context to just the nature, you think maybe of some earlier sculpture, how they relate to things you've done with, industrial gloves, with the notion of blowing things up, or aspects of the kitchen, bedroom, bathroom trilogy?
Actually, not really.
Okay.
This is sort of a hard thing to do, a kind of index of my own work. There are a couple of catalogs over there. I have a website.
Okay,
Stuart, yourself, you do a better job than I would. It would be too embarrassing.
Okay. Okay.
Because you skirted that one,
I'll only make it harder. Okay. Yeah, take a deep breath. A range of art. I mean, in this case, in various ways, both of these people are successful artists in that they exhibit their work, they sell their work, the work shown actively. I do want to talk about, or ask you to talk about success a little, how you would define it, how you would think how do you know you're doing well? How do you judge your sense of success by way of opportunities or time or any number of things? Part of this is coming because of a book that I'm working on that tries to tease out the distinctions between creative lives and careers. Things that you sort of do driven only by your own interest, and then what happens when you take that and put it in the world. So I'm kind of intrigued by just how you might talk about success on some level, artistic success. You thought the other thing was hard.
Oh, yes. Well, no, not really. Actually, because I want to make an ode to failure. I think failure is vastly underestimated. And I do think it's actually something that drives making art. Because no success is successful enough. I mean, there have been some lovely moments in my life, and they've never ultimately been enough. The driving force is, in fact, the failures, because there's an open-endedness to failures. The successes, how can I say this? They're kind of like a backup plan, but I live for my failures, so that there are more things to do. I can keep thinking, you mean, I looked at these two pieces here and I thought, what else can I do? You know, how they can go that much further. I usually, I'm a Canadian, right, and so Canadians are known for niceness and being positive, and so I've tried to counter that tendency of unending niceness and positive thinking, because, you know, everything's lovely in Canada as by definition. So I do think that in fact failure is an important thing. So I'd make a note to them. You talk about sex.
No, I would agree. But yeah, no, I feel like that it's the feeling of success is like hard to pinpoint, and there's like it's so fleeting and really almost hardly there at all. Like there's almost like a moment in the studio where you feel like, oh my God, like this was great. It's wide open. I know what I want to be doing, and you feel like things are working, and then you start to make it the thing, and it always like takes its own course, which I think is really interesting. You know, because then it's not really. It gets much more complicated, and it's really like. It can turn on a dime. Like it's like most of the time you feel kind of miserable, and then there's like one day, like maybe every 4 months, like where you feel like, oh, this is great, you know, or you try to like be delusional, you know, like it's gonna be great.
But it just occurred to me though, there is that aspect of when you know when something is finished. There's a kind of a success for a piece. Often for me, what's important is when all of a sudden I've been working on, let's say, because I work a lot with figures, if I can think of a time or a place or a person, sometimes I work a lot with clay, for instance. I have an idea more or less where I want to go, and then there's a day or an hour when all of a sudden I know who that person is or that place was, and all of a sudden there's kind of a moment I think, oh, that's Doug White in grade 7. That day, or that's somebody's armpit, or that's, you know, they're very sharp moments. Right. So there's a, because when you asked your question, I assumed there was a kind of career success implicit in it.
A little, but not entirely.
Yeah, but if I talked about a piece success, I think often it's when there's I can place it in, I don't know if you know, there's a writer named Doris Lessing. She wrote a beautiful book called The Golden Notebook, and she has this metaphor of a four-gated city. And she says in her mind is like a four-gated city, and she puts different people at the gates. And the gatekeeper is both to let someone in and keep something out. You know, there's that double function of a gatekeeper. And she talks about how she resolves problems by placing different friends at the gates so that they will they come up with the right answer, which always comes to the point where we actually know, we don't ask questions not knowing what we want for an answer. We already kind of know what the answer is going to be. But I say that because when I'm working in the studios, it's when I can sort of almost put that piece at one of the gates and say, okay, that's what that's going to do in this world that I've been putting together. So that's when the piece is successful.
Yeah.
Did you want to go, Brenda?
Well, no, I was just going to say that I think that, yeah, it's really particular, that moment where you start to feel like the piece actually clicks in and that it begins to work, and I don't know where I'm going with this now. I think, yeah, but I think it is something that you can't really predict, and it's something where maybe it starts to feel real, like it stops being a painting or a sculpture, but it feels like actually like a real thing that's like some sort of thing in the room, and I think that's always kind of an amazing thing when it happens.
Both of both comments that you made of putting me into a collection of various previous statements by artists. I mean, you just said something that's quite similar to one of my favorites, is a classic Philip Guston's statement, mostly from the work in the 50s, where he says that there's a moment in the process of making where the air of the arbitrary vanishes. And it sounds sort of exactly like what you're talking about, that sense that it is coming into its own and the decisions seem almost sort of ready-made, or the thing is talking back and claiming itself. And so, Stephen, responding to your comment, another classic, and it's a well-known story, that in the heyday of the 1950s, when Willem de Kooning was probably the most emulated painter on the planet, people would say to him, you know, doesn't it bother you? There are so many younger artists, so many people who are making paintings that look very much like yours. And his response was, yes, but they can't make the bad ones. And so, you know, to your point, the thing is won over every time. And so, you know, sales or or exhibitions or where career is going, Agnes Martin speaks about this. I mean, any number of people, you know, will play that relationship of external validation versus, you know, private studio angst all the time. And so it is an ongoing process. I know that often people come to hear us do this, but I want to make sure to leave ample time for questions that people in the audience might have. So if we want to get over and ask a handful of things, if you speak loudly, I will repeat your question, keep it to a shortish question if possible, and we'll see if Dana and Stephen want to pick up your thoughts. Anyone? Craig Drennan.
I just want to ask, I was thinking of Dana first, but for both artists, what was your drawing training like as a very young person? Like, did you draw a lot? Was it important?
People in the back here, the question was about early training. What was their formative relationship to drawing?
You go first.
Well, I went to, I actually started drawing when I first started making art, and then probably like a lot of people, you know, it's the easiest thing. It's right there. You can draw all the time. And then I went to undergraduate school in Cleveland, and they had this really intense. I think there's someone out there from Cleveland. There she is. This intense foundation program, which was 2 years, and it was a lot of drawing, just tons of observational drawing. They had like a whole semester dedicated to watercolor, which is kind of weird, I think. But Charles Birchfield was from Cleveland, so and I think it was great. I think it's actually really helpful, because when I'm making paintings now, it's easier for me to figure out where the light source is coming from, even if I'm not looking at an image like a photograph or something like that. I can kind of be able to describe the object in space, because I kind of know from a lot of observational drawing early on, and so I think that was really helpful. They used a lot of charcoal in Cleveland. Everyone looked like they came from a coal mine. Like, you know, it was, yeah.
My experience was quite a bit different in the sense that I went to school started art in 1970 in Toronto at York University. 1970 was sort of the years when your goal was whatever to do, not to do it well. The fear of mastery was overwhelming, and particularly noticeable in drawing. But so that generally, if you started to feel that you could do it really well, you worked very hard to make sure that you didn't continue to do it really well. It was a kind of peculiar sense of this would be a guarantee of authenticity. Or if it wasn't authentic, at least it was going to be conceptual. A lot of my training was about, doing it blindfolded with my right hand when I'm left-handed, behind my back, on a piece of paper inside a box that I can't see. My training was clearly not about that. It had the most peculiar effect because I actually liked drawing well in that sense of rendering. And to be honest, actually, I didn't show my drawings until a few years ago. I kind of felt a little bit vieux, you know, sort of a bit old-fashioned. That the kinds of drawings I did, I've got over that now. But it certainly was not at all the training I got. Not at all.
Other Louis?
Yeah, I guess I got kind of a long question, but it's for Dana. It's about.
I want to just hand them this so I don't have to. It's close enough.
The question is about. It's for Dana for the difference between how you think of what you're doing in drawing versus painting, because you know, the first thing I think of your work is color in the painting. It's really vibrant color. It's very alive. But obviously, the gestural part, the drawing is kind of the structure and is crucial. And in seeing this work, I immediately thought, oh my God, this is a great show. This is a great show. But what I realized is that many of the drawings actually do have a painting that's behind it. And I don't know all of them do, but I've seen some of them. And you know, there are individual drawings in here that I would think, well, okay, that's not quite enough. Something is missing, and the painting is actually fulfillment. And this is a draft for the painting. But most of these feel completely, you know, complete to me as their own entity. And the idea that you did this and then followed up with a painting, which can be, you know, in most cases is equally good, they're sort of equivalent. But the idea that drawing is preparatory to painting, in many of these cases, it doesn't feel that way to me. It feels like it's actually quite complete in and of itself as a finished piece. And so I guess I'm wondering, when you see that, why do you then make a painting of it? And how does the painting make you feel about the drawing and vice versa?
Wow, that's a great question. Because that was like the problem with drawing. I mean, why I always felt funny about showing drawings, because I never knew if they were enough. Like I was like, oh, is this enough? You know? And the ones that I had shown in the past tended to be much more finished drawings, like the ones from 2004. There was a drawing show, and I was like, okay, now I will make a drawing that will go outside of my studio, you know. And those ones actually were didn't quite have paintings that came after them, but they had not of the exact same image. But some of the more recent ones, I've been really trying not to draw with charcoal. It was actually really difficult for me to find a medium in drawing. Just because I felt like maybe charcoal was too romantic or maybe too easy, too seductive, you know? So I was like, oh, if I can make a drawing with just lines, and how could that work, you know? And they were actually made after, like the swimming one was made after the painting, and the eye cutting one. But it was kind of like as a way to see how you could get it to translate, you know, with just lines. And it is weird when I'm, and then some of them, like the one with the eye poking, that was from before a painting, and that was one that I didn't know if I would include in the show, because I felt like, oh, maybe it's not enough. Like I liked it. It was in my studio, but I never thought of it as this finished drawing. But the lines kind of felt like, I kind of liked how it was simple, and it felt really close to thinking, like it was closer to the decisions or working it out. But yeah, that's something that I'm actually really not sure about, because it's true. Like if you make a drawing and it's perfect the way it is, then why make this painting, you know? And so I don't know.
Do you want to add printmaking into the mix? We haven't really talked about that at all. So there's a couple of moments where color does manifest itself. You want to talk a little bit about how printmaking?
I like woodblock. This is terrible to say, but I actually really don't like the process of printmaking at all. I hate it deeply. No, but I really love woodblock, because somehow it feels closer to sculpture in a way. Like and maybe painting too, because the mark is so mediated through the tool, that I think that when I started making a lot of wood block cuts, or wood cuts, I started thinking about my facture differently. Like I sort of changed. It really helped me get out of this way of painting. I was making a lot of paintings that were really plainer, and you couldn't quite do that as much with the woodcut. So it changed how I thought about stroke and painting and stroke.
I was just thinking that printmaking kind of it reminds me of his comments about mediated drawing. You know, it's like trying to draw with your left hand when you're like in a box that you can't see inside of.
Yeah.
Sometimes.
Do you make prints?
Yes, yeah. Yes, I like
My question's for Stephen. I love the whimsical poses of these tremendously. My question's for Stephen. I love the whimsical poses of these big hulking figures, and I wondered if you would speak about your decisions for the playfulness of or what I'm interpreting as being very playful within their bulk and their almost threatening presences, being very playful.
Yeah.
People hear that in the back? Question was the nature of the hulking, the bigness of the hulking nature of the figures set against the kind of whimsy of the gestures, and could Stephen address that?
Well, yes, I mean, actually, Stuart said that the overriding line of the show was images of masculinity. I mean, I didn't do these pieces for the show, but it is something that I'm interested in, is that kind of tenderness or introspection. Quite often, there's kind of a limit. I'm trying to find a turf for, let's say, images of men that's different than the ones that have been laid out. I mean, to a certain extent, men in action could be sports, related to sports. They're doing something, in which case the fact that their bodies are somewhat secondary because they're actually doing, their goal is elsewhere, or they're going to go somewhere and do something, so that kind of active image. That's one thing. The other is this kind of very erotic image. A lot of gay artists who, you know, insist upon sort of like a very erotic charged image of the body, which is also an interesting thing to do. It's just not what I wanted to do. I'm particularly interested in a kind of intimate moment where, because I think that intimacy is it's a strange other turf that quite often we don't necessarily accord ourselves as men. Is the idea of being conscious, but conscious of both the sort of general tendency to hairiness and sweatiness, but there's this delicacy as well. And so I wanted to do pieces that had that suggestion of hulkiness or hairiness or sweatiness plus a moment of delicacy. A number of my pieces in clay often have just moments where someone's touching their arm, their hand on their shoulder, or lifting just one leg off the ground, lying on the ground. There's, I don't know if you've been to Mass Mocha. There's those sheets of pink paper that are Bruce Nauman, where he says, take off your clothes, press yourself against the wall. It just goes on about sort of recognizing yourself, and that really made me, you know, that piece reminded me of how I've worked in different moments, but without necessarily thinking about Bruce Nauman. But I felt a kind of conversation between the two of us. Hot summer in Toronto, lying on the cement floor in the basement, just wanting to feel the coolness, and just being the strange thing of having a body and thinking it's just kind of a weird body, though. You know, if this is really what I got, it's not what I was expecting. I'm not sure what I was expecting. I didn't expect this anyhow, but so this kind of thing that I've often tried to play with is trying to figure out, well, you know, how did I get this? You know, yeah.
Stephen,
I
can
don't
you
know
talk,
if that makes sense.
no, absolutely. Can you
Oh,
talk
good.
about placement? Because one of the things that comes along with you bringing these works here, inflating them, including them in a group show, was where are they going to go in the room? And how does the audience address them when they first are seen? So their placement was a key. You want to talk a little bit just about the decisions of where they wound up and why they wound up there?
Yeah, sure. Well, a lot of the way the relationship between bases or the walls or the floor is something that interests me a lot. So quite often I think about how can a body come off a wall, leap up from the floor, how can I make it light and quirky, or to create a space around it. I am really interested in how much space can be around something. And for instance, here I was interested in having the back of the bodies facing the viewer when they first came in, so that it's not sort of all up front. It's something that I figured, well, some people might not be interested in that work anyhow. And in that case, well, I'm sort of done for. I'm not going to convince them. But if someone is interested to walk around, I'd like to have them take the time to walk around. That, for instance, that piece in the corner, I wanted to get it far enough into the corner that you feel that you're sort of in a corner to see the face and the more distinguishing features of that piece. But that it's a decision you make, and if you decide not to make it, well, then that's fine too. You decided you didn't. It's like, when you go to the Venice Biennial and you think, oh my God, not another video. You think, either I'm really going to sit it through it, in which or stand through it, because incidentally you almost never get to sit. And then you decide to make that commitment, and all right, I'm really going to do it. Or you decide, I'm skipping that one. So, I think it's like that idea of just getting it over and done with, that they're going to engage with my work or they're not. And there are people who don't, and I understand that too.
I think we have time for one more question. Let's make it a doozy. Okay, pressure's on.
I'm still kind of halfway formulating this question as I'm thinking, but this question's for, I guess mainly for Dana, but I'm interested in what you have to say as well. Just in terms of process, I'm a process-oriented artist, and I'm just curious how much of your art is in the moment. You're spilling out paint or drawing, and it's coming out of your mind, and you go nonstop. I remember you saying that you mix your paints beforehand, typically, and so you can be in the flow of the art. And I'm just curious what that process is like to you. How often do you think about your ideas, and your art comes from your ideas, or how often does it change from that initial idea?
It changes quite a bit while I'm painting, but there is so much prep work, which I don't enjoy. Sometimes it can be sort of therapeutic, mixing colors, but it's not fun until you're sort of painting, and usually it, but I always kind of have an image in mind, like something that I think I want to get across, or a particular thing about the image. Like, for example, the person cutting their eyelashes. I made a painting of that, and it was a kind of, what I did know that I wanted was that kind of feeling of the root of the eyelash and the eyelid, and the kind of feeling of the scissors. This kind of, but what I didn't expect was, as it was going out, it really had this sort of clicking feeling, and that the mouth ended up having this doubleness to it, and it felt like more of a chatter or something. And then it felt like really appropriate that the person should be on the phone, and that maybe they should be looking in the mirror, because that's when you kind of do things like that. So it'll start with a structure too in mind, but it does change as it's going on. And then sometimes it's just awful, and you scrape it off. But I usually, I don't know, when I'm painting, I'll paint usually pretty straight through, and a lot of wet to wet painting. And sometimes there'll be one layer will dry, and it's almost like constructing a stage set or something. Like one area is dry, and then you can paint another layer on top of it. But yeah, so it kind of, it works like that. I think when you're painting, I had an argument with my husband recently. He's gonna be annoyed that I'm saying this about process, because I was like, it's not process. Like I think of process as something that you're really conscious of, but when you're painting, I never feel like, well, now this is my process that I go through. It's like, no, you're just painting, and you're not really aware of. But I guess that is the process of it. I mean, it's
intellectualizing the actual event, like talking about it afterwards is kind of hard to.
Yeah, well, it's really weird because a lot of artists, and they'll be kind of like, well, I have friends who are really engaged in process, and it's in a really particular way. Like there's a kind of content to the process itself, and when I'm painting, I don't think that I'm never maybe as so conscious of what I'm doing as when I'm actually like, you're just responding to the thing and going back and forth, and I don't know. But I guess, yeah, it's process. I listen to music, and that's process. I sit on the floor sometimes.
Well, I think you're right, though. I would say stick to the idea it's not process. I think because at least when I think of process, I do think of it as it's like this other activity. There's mold making or
yeah, like
wood
you
blocks,
make an omelet, you know the process. Well, no, that's actually more creative too. You can be very creative when you make it.
Yes, pretty direct.
Okay,
but
never mind.
I just think the process tends to pull us towards this other activity that's parallel to but not the same as.
Right. Yeah.
And you have to do it to finish it. Whereas I think certainly if you're talking about painting wet on wet, there's maybe like this very small amount of process, but there's something so direct. You're not having this other activity. You don't have to do 3 days of something or other in order to do it. You've just described how you've tried to shorten that as much as possible. So,
well, it's also so unpredictable too, because you can be painting for like a really long time, and it feels like process. Like it feels bad, like you feel like, oh, I'm building this up so this moment can happen, or I'm feeling, you're not really in the zone, but you're painting, but maybe there'll be a moment, like maybe for an hour, where you're actually really painting, and it's actually really happening and clicking, and it's weird. I always feel like those moments feel like process to me. Like I'm like, oh, this is when I'm doing this thing, because then this other thing will hopefully happen, and maybe it won't, but it's sort of like this is so cheap. If you build it, it will come, or something. I don't know. Yeah.
I think we have to end on the sentiment that if you build it, people will come, because obviously, we have these exhibitions, we have this art center, you've all come, so this theory works. With that in mind, I just really want to thank people for coming, for being involved in the range of programming that we do. Please fill out the little surveys. There's some amazing projects going on in the city, a lot of openings tonight, so if you find yourself beginning the weekend with more hunger for exhibitions, certainly there's a fair amount going on. I just want to thank Stephen and Dana both for being with us, and thank you all for coming, and look forward to seeing you at future events. Thanks so much.